So when I saw this cartoon, I could not resist it for the cover of the bulletin. It reminds me of my first year in the church I served in Pittsburgh, where Karen, the teenage daughter of the also recently arrived minister of music, was looking for a place to sit and worship, since both of her parents were in the choir loft, which was behind the pulpit. One of her first Sundays, she sat on the second row right side of the sanctuary, and when the Martins arrived, not their real names, they stared uncomfortably for a few seconds before actually saying out loud, "Excuse me, this is where we always sit." Karen was quite embarrassed and a little bothered, but being the compliant daughter of a church music professional, she moved to another seat. The next week, Karen thought she'd play it safe and take the opposite tack. Instead of sitting near the front, she went up to the balcony and the back row of the balcony of this 600-seat sanctuary and sat on the very back row next to the pole rope for the steeple bell. Believe it or not, another husband and wife couple, we'll call them the Smiths, pulled exactly the same stunt, staring awkwardly at Karen until she moved. Now, granted, Karen had the worst possible luck in her seating attempts. It's not as if this large sanctuary was a standing room only situation on a Sunday morning. And of all the members of the church, these two couples were probably the most likely to stare her down until she moved. So the next Sunday, after hearing of Karen's plight, she came and talked to me about it. I took the opportunity to remind the congregation that these were God's pews and did not belong to any of us, and that the proper response to seeing someone in the pew where you normally sit, especially a visitor or a young person, is to introduce yourself, say how glad you are to see them, and go sit somewhere else. Well, in our reading of the Gospel of Luke, we have a similar dynamic going on in the religious community. Different cultural context, but same human proclivity. Who sits where becomes a sign of status in the community. Luke tells us that those who gathered for a meal at the house of this Pharisee were watching Jesus closely. Will he heal on the Sabbath? Will he wash before he eats? Will he follow the rules around what to eat and with whom? The Pharisees are waiting to catch Jesus in the act of religious law breaking. Their close watching is a form of surveillance, a means of collecting evidence in order to convict. But Jesus is also watching, or as the text says, Jesus is noticing. He notices different things, paying attention not to the religious rules, but to God's people. As is his custom, Jesus notices God's people everywhere he goes. No matter the chaos around him, in pushing crowds, he feels the woman touch his garment. At the temple, he sees the widow put in her offering of all that she has. He calls to him the woman bent over for 18 years. He sees his soon-to-be disciples hauling in nets. He sees Zacchaeus up in a tree. Jesus' watching is about noticing people in order to heal and teach and save and enlist into his kingdom's work. His close watching is about awareness, like a parent at a crowded park, not a security guard behind a monitor. We are aware of these different kinds of watching, these different kinds of noticing, of seeing. Every social setting we walk into has its own special unspoken arrangements. There are certain seating protocols at a business meeting, even for our session meetings and deacons meetings. And family dinners have their own arrangements. And the school cafeteria is a place where there's a lot of watching going on. Or dinner at a place like the Poinsett Club has certain expectations. Or the waiting area at a restaurant. Did those people just cut in line to speak to the hostess? Is that young guy with the tattoos really not going to offer his seat to the 80-year-old woman standing beside him? Jesus notices people. Jesus notices us and our arrangements. And then he joins us. He sits with us. He eats with us. often in ways that surprise us. So the title of this sermon is not the familiar WWJD, what would Jesus do, but WWJS, what would Jesus see? Or perhaps who would Jesus see? And this is the question we who are followers of Jesus are called by the gospel to ask. WWJS, what would Jesus see? What would Jesus notice? The reason we are challenged by Jesus seeing is that we get ourselves into patterns of seeing, much like those at the Pharisees' house. We get into ruts so deep that we cannot see out over the edges of them. Very often we see only what we expect to see or what we want to see, and we do not see what we do not want to see. But Jesus challenges our seeing, and to be a disciple of Jesus is to learn to ask what Jesus would see. One of the things I encourage our church officers to do at church gatherings is to notice people on the periphery. One of the wonderful things about our church family experience is the fellowship we enjoy with our church friends who know us well. We want to catch up with each other when we gather. It's an important part of the support that we receive from one another in the Christian community. But are we also looking outward? Do we notice those on the periphery who may not be connecting with anyone, who may need to have our circle of fellowship opened to them? It's the role of our church's servant leaders to notice who is standing where and who is sitting where, and to care about them and to reach out to them. For that matter, it's not just church leaders who are called to this kind of noticing, but any disciple of Jesus. But we easily see only what we want to see, only what we are looking for. Today in Sunday school, we're beginning a 6-week class on race and reconciliation. There is perhaps no more pressing example today of our problems with seeing than in our racial perceptions. I must confess that until recently, I have not wanted to see how much racial discrimination still exists in our culture. I have preferred to think that we have made great strides in American culture in becoming colorblind. But I'm afraid this is not the case, particularly these days in our perception of who society's criminals are. I'm reading a book called The New Jim Crow by law professor Michelle Alexander that describes the disproportionate incarceration of African Americans that has been the unfortunate result of the war on drugs. Disproportionate because the vast majority of drug users and dealers today are white. Only about 15% of drug users today are black. Even so, 3/4 of all people imprisoned for drug offenses have been black or Latino. What do we notice when we see a young black or Hispanic man walking down the street? What do we see when we see that? And what would Jesus see? A survey was conducted back in 1995 asking the following question: would you close your eyes for a second and envision a drug user and describe that person to me? 95% of respondents pictured a black drug user, while only 5% imagined other racial groups. Yet then and now, only 15% of drug users in America are black. Would that study yield different results today? I kind of doubt it. This kind of seeing is known as implicit bias. It may not be intentional on the part of the perceiver, but it's still racism. So when Jesus sees a young black or Hispanic man walking down the street, what would Jesus see? What would Jesus notice? And how about us? Of course, there's another question to ask beyond what Jesus sees. Once we have seen, what are we going to do about what we see? In other words, asking the questions WWJS, what would Jesus see, must for the disciple lead to the next WWJS, where would Jesus sit? Jesus' wise counsel to those at the Pharisees' dinner party comes straight out of the book of Proverbs. It is not an unusual teaching to come from the mouth of a Jewish rabbi familiar with the Hebrew wisdom tradition. All present would have nodded in agreement with this sage advice. But Jesus does not conclude with the traditional admonition of prudence. He goes on to challenge the common sense of a world of social ladder climbing. When you give a luncheon or a dinner, do not invite your friends or your brothers or your relatives or your rich neighbors in case they may invite you in return and you would be repaid. But when you give a banquet, invite the poor, the crippled, the lame, and the blind, and you will be blessed because they cannot repay you, for you will be repaid at the resurrection of the righteous. Jesus reminds us that there is a higher standard being applied than the social standards of our class-conscious society. It is God's standard of hospitality, which puts a premium on hospitality to strangers. For as Hebrews reminds us, in showing hospitality to strangers, some have entertained angels without knowing it. Where would Jesus sit? Would he sit in places and with people that make us uncomfortable? Would he have been sitting with Rosa Parks in 1955 when she insisted on remaining seated in the white section of the bus? Would he sit in a Black Lives Matter meeting? Or would he walk with the peaceful protests down Main Street? Would he welcome the homeless to sit beside him for a meal? Would he offer a soldier with PTSD a place beside him in the pew? Would he sit on a bus full of Mexicans being transported back across the border? Would he sit in the car with a police officer putting his life on the line to serve and protect our community? Where would Jesus sit? Would he sit with us? Does he sit with us at our communion table? We have just adopted the Belhar Confession into our Presbyterian Book of Confessions, a theological challenge written in the 1980s to stand against apartheid in South Africa. For many years, the policy of the Dutch Reformed Church of South Africa was for the Lord's Supper to be administered without distinction of color. However, due to the request of a group of white members back in 1857, an exception was made in order to accommodate, quote, the weakness of some. The weaker ones being the white members requesting separate communion between whites and blacks. This pastoral exception became common practice, and then the common practice eventually developed into an elaborate theology that sought to ground that separation of the races in the structures of creation. This led to the churches supporting apartheid, a scary trajectory that grew from who was and who wasn't at the table. Perhaps this is why Jesus pays such close attention to God's people. Our seating arrangements matter for the kingdom of God, as the Belhar Confession proclaims boldly. Perhaps this is why Jesus calls his disciples to a mission of paying attention, to a ministry of seeing, to a theology of noticing, to a practice of sitting with those who are unacceptable to polite and successful society. Like it or not, Jesus does not allow us to become too settled, too comfortable, too focused on our own status, or too committed to our own success and comfort. I cannot tell you exactly what this means for you. I'm still not entirely sure what it means for me. Only Jesus can tell you. Only Jesus can tell us. What would Jesus see among us? Where would Jesus sit among us? May God give us ears to hear what the Spirit is saying to the church.